Thank you very much, Anne. As Anne mentioned, I'd like for people to hold questions till the end of the talk. And this will be a Zoom talk. And at the end of the slides, then we'll be open for questions. My topic tonight, Theosophical Resilience in Troubled Times, originated, of course, in our struggles to deal with the pandemic situation that we've all been confronting for over a year now. And it is partially a result of having to deal with people in my classes and watching them week by week experience various ups and downs where their resilience would be negatively affected, and then noticing what helped them turn that around. And in particular, there are a number of interesting texts and principles taught by our theosophical literature that I think are very useful in dealing with this topic of resilience, even though, as far as I know, that hasn't been done before in any book that I've seen. So welcome to this talk on theosophical resilience in troubled times. So let's start with the definition of resilience. Some of you may have seen a definition of resilience that was sent along with the invitation or on Facebook for this talk. And I've refined it a little bit since I sent that out. So I'm defining resilience as knowing or being able to quickly figure out what to do next under any given set of potentially adverse circumstances. And in particular, we need to be thinking about resilience in terms of self-care and care of others. Now, there are a couple things about this definition that I want to point out. One is any given set. Now, if you hear that in a mathematical or even a sociological context, usually it's theoretical. But obviously here we are in a pandemic where we have a very given set of potentially adverse circumstances. And that brings me to the second word I want to highlight, which is the word potentially. Because even though there are certainly dangers of the pandemic situation that we've been experiencing, the actual adversity of those experiences in any individual case can be very much a matter of our resilience. So it's possible with a proper attitude, for example, to greatly reduce the adversity or even possibly eliminate it. Now, in order to talk about resilience, I think it's important for us to understand the nature of the opposite of resilience, and this is trauma. I've been working for a couple of years now with a specific definition of trauma that I think is very different from the way most people think about it. I think about trauma as shock caused by more distress-causing physical, emotional, intellectual, financial, or spiritual experience/information coming into the individual or collective psyche than can be processed in real time. So let's just look at that for a moment. First of all, shock. Yes, we know what that is. It's a kind of immobilization or paralysis. And in the case of trauma, it's brought about by distress. The thing that most people think about with trauma is physical trauma, which is a wound, or emotional trauma, which is some form of abuse. But I think it's legitimate to say that there are other kinds of trauma, intellectual trauma, when there's more information than we can process in real time. Certainly also, many of us have experienced some degree of financial trauma in respect of the pandemic because of fluctuations in the economy or even our own employment. And then spiritual experience. Sometimes you'll hear stories of people who've been totally overwhelmed by some kind of spiritual peak experience. But I think in all cases, what happens is we're not just taking in the experience, we're also taking in information. And that what actually paralyzes us or causes the shock is the feeling that we can't process that information in any short period of time, what I'm calling real time. It might take us months to deal with it, not a couple of hours. And then finally, if we think about each of us having an individual psyche or soul, but also a collective psyche or soul, you could say the mass consciousness of humanity, that it's also possible to talk about something like the pandemic as a shock or trauma causing event that's happening nationally and internationally, as well as individually. So what I hope to do in the course of the talk is help people understand some of the ways in which we might be able to deal with this issue of not being able to process the distress causing information quickly enough, and then end up in some form of immobilization where we can't take action on behalf of ourselves, self-care, or on behalf of others, care of others. So let's think a little bit about some basic resilience skills. Acting, which comes at the physical level of being, feeling, coming at the emotional level of being, thinking, coming at the intellectual level of being, understanding, coming at the spiritual level, and finally, intuiting, which could be traced to a higher spiritual. Some of you who are familiar with the Theosophical teachings on the subtle bodies will recognize that actually what I've done here is list some of those bodies. That's some topic that I'll come back to in a later slide. But let's look a little more specifically at what's meant by these. So if we're acting on the physical plane, one of the ways that we promote resilience is by focusing on thriving instead of just merely surviving. Now, obviously, some of us will really be in a situation where we have to just focus on survival. But somehow the idea of thriving in addition to surviving, I think, is important for having resilience at the physical level of being. If we move on then to the emotional or feeling level, let's say compassion versus self-pity. I think we've all seen people that we know who indulge in self-pity whenever they experience any adverse circumstances. And it's pretty obvious that self-pity is very paralyzing. Somehow the idea of developing a compassion for oneself and a compassion for others who might also be suffering, especially when we've got an international trauma, so to speak, going on, that can help us restore resilience at the feeling level. At the thinking level, there's the issue of large view versus small view. Now, under ordinary circumstances, what we need is the ability to shuttle back and forth between the large view and the small view. But the problem is, when we're traumatized and our resilience is negatively affected, we tend to focus on the small view, which is me and mine. And again, that's important. Certainly, survival, self-care, and care of others will focus on that small view. But we also have to think of the much larger picture in order to keep our thinking clear enough so that we'll be resilient. With understanding, which I'm calling a spiritual aspect of resilience, we need to have the ability to know the difference between truth and belief. And that's a very tricky one because there are people who don't necessarily make distinctions, such as between a relative belief and a universal belief or an absolute belief or a personal belief. And so if we're striving to think with resilience at the spiritual level, we need to have some form of sensing the truth that goes beyond merely thinking that we know the truth, which is a form of belief. And here especially is an area where theosophical teachings can be useful. And then finally, with intuiting, which I'm calling higher spiritual, there's the need to differentiate between joy and comfort. Now, I'm taking joy to be something more than happiness. I'm taking joy to be that bubbling up of inspiration or life force or willingness to be present in the body on the planet that comes from some kind of spiritual awareness, some kind of connection to a higher power. And if we're able to feel that and live from that, if we're able to recognize when we've lost touch with it and learn how to restore it, I think we have the maximum level of resilience. And here again, theosophical teachings can be very useful. Comfort, on the other hand, I think is a great enemy of joy, and it's often associated with, I suppose you could call it lower happiness. But I'm noticing that there are many aspects of the pandemic that have become difficult precisely because of the degree to which people hold on to comfort. And one of them I'll say I've noticed about the United States is for those vaccinations that require 2 doses, it seems that there are upwards of 5 million people who got the first dose and not the second dose. And it's pretty easy based on the news to realize that probably the reason for that is people have heard that they may experience some flu-like symptoms following the second shot. And because that would make them uncomfortable, they don't want to do it. On the other hand, you could perhaps set that against the joy of a certain amount of freedom that comes from being fully vaccinated, if, of course, you believe in the efficacy of vaccinations. So we also need to think about what I'm calling resilience challenges. These specifically are the things that I've noticed, especially in my classes, in the news, and the people around me, that seem to slow down everybody's ability to process what's going on. Knowledge versus ignorance. Now, ignorance here, I want everybody to understand, is not meant to be belittling in any sense. What I mean is, this is an unprecedented situation. Not even the world's major scientists had any idea of what to do about it. And so everybody was in a situation of ignorance of what was involved and what would be required of us. And slowly we've had to acquire knowledge in order to do that. The willingness to participate in that experience, which means, for example, scientists doing research, but also for us lay people to be aware of that research, that helps us increase resilience. Another one is what I'm calling consent versus denial. So I'm thinking that under any adverse set of circumstances, if we find ourselves in the middle of them, we really have to consent to the fact that they're there and that we're in the middle of them. And if we don't do that, our resilience suffers. There are, of course, a million different ways in which people can deny that there is a crisis or that I have any personal involvement with it. And that can very much slow down resilience, both at the individual level, but also in the larger social level. So it's important to understand that we really have to, unfortunately, say yes to the fact that we are in adverse circumstances before we can restore our resilience. Another issue is adaptation versus resistance. And this is very much an aspect of what I was talking about earlier about comfort. I think in many cases, resistance to any form of change comes from the comfort of habit and routine. But we have to learn, in order to be resilient, through consenting to the experience that we're in, how to adapt appropriately to that experience. And then we've got care versus neglect, which I think is an issue that many people experience because of denial and resistance. Neglect can be a natural result of denial and resistance, neglect of self-care and neglect of care of others. Whereas if we're going to be resilient, we need to be thinking about care of self and care of others. This one is one I think everybody will recognize. How do we take action in the midst of so many different ideas, beliefs, or possible truths about what's going on? How do we manage the overwhelm of all the information that's coming in, especially all the information about the various ways that people are dealing with the situation. I think it would be safe to say that one view we could take of the pandemic is that it's a massive social experiment where if we look around us, we'll see absolutely every conceivable way of dealing with it, from something that works to something that fails and creates illness and possibly death. So, how do we manage to prevent ourselves from feeling overwhelmed? Sometimes the way to do that is to have a sense of the action that we need to take, right action, in other words. Then we also need to think about equanimity versus resentment. And in the United States, of course, we have had a very resentful regime under President Trump. And one of the things that he promoted was the idea that China was fully responsible for all of this. And so a lot of people have been blaming China, and one of the results is an uptick in the number of Asian people or people who are perceived as being of Asian descent being attacked, brutalized, abused. So obviously one component of dealing with resilience is learning how not to blame and to develop a kind of equanimity in ourselves and with respect to other people, recognizing that we are all in this grand social experiment, and beating each other up is probably not a reasonable way of dealing with it. And then, especially for something that's lasted as long, and I certainly appreciate how long it's lasted for you in England because of the length of the extreme lockdowns that you've experienced. Nothing was ever quite that extreme here in the United States. So endurance becomes another very important aspect of resilience. So now I want to start getting into some of the theosophical approaches that may be useful for thinking about these issues of resilience. And I'll draw quite heavily in this talk on the key to theosophy, which, as many of you know, is the attempt that Helena Petrovna Blavatsky made to specifically outline the ethics of theosophy. And ethics is an important part of understanding how to act wisely under any social circumstance. And I think there's a lot there that we could study about how to deal with adverse circumstances, even though the book wasn't specifically written for that purpose. So what she says is relief of human suffering under any or every form is one of the aims of theosophy. And she highlights physical suffering, but also moral suffering, and says that moral suffering in some respects may be more important than physical. And I think from the perspective of resilience, that's very true. Because if we're not dealing with moral suffering, we end up with a lot of people who are paralyzed and can't take action, even to take care of themselves physically. She also talks about inculcation of ethics as one of the aims of theosophy. And I think we need to understand that in both ways, which means self-inculcation, that is constantly thinking about the ethics of the situations that we're experiencing, including behavior that we feel is ethical behavior and behavior that we think is not ethical behavior as we look around us. That's one of the ways, perhaps, if we look at it experimentally, to reduce the amount of resentment. Of everybody, of course, creates their karma, and if people make unwise, unethical choices, sometimes that experience of karma will come right back at them. And as we watch all of these things develop, the news stories of, for example, the people who deny the existence of the crisis and then who come out down with the COVID-19 virus, that would be an example of a kind of karmic issue that developed from an ethical stance that actually may not have been helpful or resilient. So inculcation of ethics, not just for ourselves, but also in our own behavior, being ethical in a way that acts as an example for others. And then HPB also talks about purification of the soul in respect to one of the aims of Theosophy, and this also has something to do with resilience. Now, before I get to that, I want to just point out a couple of thoughts. I put these in parentheses because they're not a part of the passage that I'm drawing from the Key to Theosophy. So I've often thought that the Buddhist teaching about suffering is one of the bases of the problems that we experience as being human and how we have to free ourselves from that suffering. What would happen if that teaching were altered just slightly and suffering were talked about as need or as needfulness? The reason I'm bringing this up is our ideal is to find some way of being active in respect to the things that we're experiencing. And we can only really do that if we have something to focus on. And the problem is suffering is not so easy to focus on. We see it, but what is it? What type is it? And how best can we ameliorate it? If we see suffering as need, it starts to become much clearer that there is perhaps an action we can take. We can identify that need and we can see what is possible for us to do to satisfy it or help someone satisfy it. So I want people to keep that in mind as an important aspect of thinking about resilience, especially because it's so easy to become overwhelmed by the amount of suffering we know is going on in the world. As far as inculcation of ethics, let's think about that as right relations with God, however we conceive that particular higher power, with our own soul and with humanity at large. That I would call the purpose of ethics. And certainly there are many theosophical teachings about those right relations. Then with purification of the soul, we have something that I'm calling either compassionate joy or joyful compassion. Now, the thing I think people don't often understand, and I certainly have seen it with my students, is that you can be joyful and you can feel at the same time the suffering that exists in the world. You don't have to be woebegone. And in fact, if in the midst of all the suffering that's going on around us, we're able to maintain a sense of joy, we're more effective in two ways. We're more resilient in dealing with the suffering in others, but we become an example to others of how they could perhaps themselves be, a way of being that they could aim for. So I haven't really seen this expression in theosophical teachings, compassionate joy or joyful compassion, but I'm offering it as a kind of ideal. And my talk as it progresses will come back to this a number of times. Now, let's look at some strength that we can take from such simple things as our three objects. Everyone knows the first object of the Theosophical Society is to form a nucleus of the universal brotherhood of humanity without distinction of race, creed, sex, caste, or color. Well, isn't that what HPB was calling relief of human suffering, physical and moral, if we apply it to the pandemic or adverse circumstances? And then with the second object, to encourage the study of comparative religion, philosophy, and science. Wasn't that what HPB was talking about with inculcation of ethics as right relations with God, soul, and humanity? I want to go just a little bit deeper into this in the next slide to talk about HPB on study. And in particular, I want to do this because I'm aware on discussions on Facebook of people that claim that we do too much study as theosophists and not enough action. And I want to say that study also is important and perhaps can be a kind of action. And in fact, HPB sanctions this in the Key to Theosophy in the following exchange. The question is, or statement is made, but all this literature, to the spread of which you attach so much importance, does not seem to me of much practical use in helping mankind. This is not practical charity. And to this, HPB, speaking as a theosophist, says, we think otherwise. We hold that a good book which gives people food for thought which strengthens and clears their minds and enables them to grasp truths which they have dimly felt but could not formulate. We hold that such a book does a real substantial good. Now, it's important for us to understand that we can only actually properly operate with our second object when we know what those books are, because we've read them. We know what real substantial good they've done for us. And under the right circumstances, if we see someone suffering in a particular way that some inculcation of ethics might help, right relations with God, the soul, and humanity, it would be helpful to hand off a book. Well, The Key to Theosophy certainly would be one of my go-to books for that. Another one, unfortunately, is out of print, but if you're able to get a copy, I think you'll agree with me that Clara Codd's book, Theosophy as the Masters See It, which is all the ethical parts of the Mahatma letters stripped of a lot of their context, so that that's all that you see. That can also be very helpful, especially for people who are not able to deal with the Mahatma letters without some form of support like a study group. The third object of the TS, to investigate unexplained laws of nature and the powers latent in humanity. This one, of course, is the one that gets constantly shunted off to the side. But I see it as an example of purification of soul to achieve compassionate joy or joyful compassion. And I also would contend this is the greatest power latent in humanity. Furthermore, that it's the key to theosophical resilience, and it is what makes relief of human suffering possible. Now, let's think about the third object as being the promotion of meditation, one result of which is inner peace, and possibly an expansion of consciousness that leads to some kind of larger sense of joy in the world, and a kind of bubbly inner joy that we want to share with others, or that helps buoy us up while we're dealing with the suffering of others in a compassionate way. And you'll see what I am meaning by this. Now, there are a number of places where we can go to our theosophical literature to get some surprising help. One of them is the three truths that comes into Mabel Collins's novel, Idyll of the White Lotus. This particular first truth you'll see in our magazine, The Theosophist, over and over and over again. And I wonder sometimes whether we're not just quoting it with a sort of raw theosophy mentality. It is a wonderful quote, very resonant. And so the soul of man is immortal, and its future is a thing whose growth and splendor has no limit. But let's think about this. Where's the growth during troubled times? Where's the splendor? We have to take a look at this from this particular lens. My take on this is that resilience requires consent to participate in growth. So first of all, we have to consent that we're in troubled times. Where's the splendor? Resilience requires seeing splendor somewhere, or we lose faith in God's soul and humanity. And I would contend that where we need to look for growth is to see the emerging brotherhood. Even though most of the news these days is made up of all of the ways in which brotherhood seems to be breaking down, we have to frame what we're going through as a challenge. You could even call it an initiatory challenge that is forcing us to confront how much we need each other and how deeply we are all connected throughout the world. And that's why I say the growth during these troubled times is in watching for and promoting an emerging sense of brotherhood. And then where is the splendor? Let's call that achieved unity consciousness. Now, I've been reading a lot of the stories on how the scientists throughout the world have been doing research and seeing their triumphs and their setbacks, their experiments, their attempts to gather data and figure out and understand what the parameters are of this completely unknown virus that slowly revealed some of its secrets. And it's really quite astonishing the amount of teamwork that's going on internationally. And for me, that's been one of the ways that I have recognized unity consciousness developing. And I view it as a kind of splendor. These are people working night and day to find a way to help us through. And of course, what are called first responders, even more so, because they're actually there dealing with the suffering in the wards where the ill have been brought. Second of the three truths, the principle which gives life wells in us and without us, is undying and eternally beneficent, is not heard or seen or smelt, but is perceived by the man who desires perception. And of course, by the man is meant by the person. I would say that we call that principle God or soul or life or joy. And if we ask the question, where is this principle within us? It's what we experience when we have been meditating for a long period of time. It's something that develops in us from the process of meditation. Where is this principle outside or without us? I would say it comes from appreciation of divine beauty in nature and other beings. And I would say also that the secret of theosophical resilience is staying in touch with this principle. If we're allowed to go outside, let's find it in nature. If we're not, let's find it in meditation, in other words. And we do this in order to help us strengthen and maintain our resilience. And then the third of the three truths, each man is his own absolute lawgiver, the dispenser of glory or gloom to himself, the decreer of his life, his reward, his punishment. And again, each person is emphasized here. Let's look at this in terms of resilience. What produces gloom or punishment? Selfishness. What produces glory and reward? Unselfishness. Of course, some would argue that we don't become unselfish for the sake of reward, but there sometimes are unintentionally received karmic benefits. How can we get through troubled times in glory instead of gloom? I would contend it's the following phrase: joyful, compassionate equanimity in service. So I've been bringing together some of the things that I've brought up. The joy is the connection to the source in us. Compassion is the ability to see the source, the divine in others, and to realize the suffering of others and that we may be called to do something about it. The recognition that we can only really do something about that suffering if we're able to maintain the equanimity that allows us not to be full of judgment, and that we need to provide some kind of service to others. So I'll come back to this notion of joyful, compassionate equanimity and service throughout my talk. So also from the Key to Theosophy, we have the idea of the four links of the golden chain. Just a reminder of the four links: universal, unity and causation; human, solidarity; law of karma; reincarnation. So once again, how do we apply these to troubled times or to our present pandemic circumstances? I would say consent to individual and collective growth. In other words, there can't be any unity, and we can't start to look at the causation, the forces in play, and find out some appropriate action that helps us go forward without simply consenting to the fact that we are in the midst of extraordinary, unprecedented, troubled times. Human solidarity, what this means, of course, is cooperation for the greater good, something like what I was talking about with the sciences. Law of karma, I would call this the wisdom to take the right, best, next step. I do think that we tend to think of karma too much in terms of doing something wrong and being punished for it, or trying not to do something wrong to avoid being punished for it, or on the other side, doing something right, either for the sake of reward or hopefully just doing it because we know it's right. But in all of our lifetimes, we've certainly developed a kind of internal wisdom based on all of our past karmic infractions. And certainly also we have access to some of that by repeating them in the present lifetime. by accident or intentionally to see what we can get away with. So why not see if we can open ourselves to draw upon that wisdom and feel what is the right best next step for us and for humanity. And then reincarnation. This involves another form of trauma, which is dealt with by feeling courage in the face of potential or actual loss and death. Now, I want to highlight the word potential here for a moment because a lot of us, confronted by the potential for loss and death, become anxious, possibly full of self-pity or fear on behalf of ourselves and those that we love. And this goes exactly against the resilience. It clogs us up. It makes it difficult for us to process in real time and therefore becomes a kind of trauma. So, what do we do about this? If we believe in reincarnation, we have to develop a kind of courage in the face of potential or actual loss and death. And that includes recognizing that those we've lost, we need certainly to grieve, but we also need to celebrate the fact that they continue, they survive, they go on to experience their own soul learning and growth. And with that, perhaps we can go on too with ours, even if we've been left behind. So I want to remind people of my definition of trauma: shock caused by more distress causing physical, emotional, intellectual, financial, or spiritual experience or information coming into the individual or collective psyche than can be processed in real time. I want to do this because I want to just take a moment to review some of the information about the principles and bodies as taught in Theosophy. This is going to go very quickly and without a lot of explanation. And my main purpose in doing it is because there is a tendency for some theosophical literature to talk about the idea of subtle bodies as taught in Theosophy as a kind of neo-theosophy and not relevant. And one of the points that I made in my book, in the annotations to Invisible Worlds about Annie Besant's teachings on psychic and spiritual development, is that the principles and the bodies are related, but they're not identical. The principles, of course, are all named after various aspects of consciousness from Sanskrit teachings. So just a very quick review: Sthula, the dense body; Linga, the subtle body; Prana, vitality; Kama, desire; Manas, mind; Buddhi, intuition, sometimes called spiritual intuition; and Atma, which I'm calling highest self, although it's sometimes called spiritual will. Now, these are correlated to the bodies as follows. The physical body is the bearer, the upadi, of these higher principles, prana linga. So prana linga sthula is the physical body. This is the case for all the bodies. They are all compound. There's a principle, and then there's the bearer of the principle. The etheric, prana linga; the astral, kama prana; mental, kama manas; causal, buddhi manas; buddhic, atmi, buddhi, atma, buddhi; and then the atmic body, atma. And finally, the correlation in the traditional theosophical teachings, going back to Blavatsky, is that the causal body is something called manas tajasa, which means illuminated body, the mind illuminated. Now, I'm only going to talk about bodies, and I'm going to dispense with the Sanskrit terms. I just wanted to make sure that people understood this relationship between principles and bodies. So the problem with trauma is that it tends to break down resilience in one or more of the bodies in the following ways. In the physical body, it threatens our survival. In the etheric body, it saps our vitality. In the astral body, it blocks the fulfillment of our needs and desires, which generates a kind of frustration, which creates the opposite of resilience, trauma. In the mental body, it breeds resentment over who's doing what and why. In the causal body, it prevents our own self-realization. In the Buddhic body, it disunites humanity, not just breaking up countries, for example, but people who have different beliefs about appropriate response to troubled times. But it also disunites humanity by causing a lot of isolation or separation from others. And then finally, at the Atmic level, it can erode our faith in higher powers. If there is a God, if there is a soul, if there's a source, if there are masters, why are they allowing this awful thing to happen to us? Well, as I said earlier, it's an initiatory challenge in learning the lesson of universal brotherhood or unity consciousness. Now, let's think about how resilience heals trauma, again, using those same bodies. At the physical level, well, we could follow safety guidelines. At the etheric level, we'll have to learn how to restore our own vitality. At the astral level, we may need to recalibrate what are true needs from what are desires that may have some hold on us, but may actually not be essential. At the mental level, promoting kindness to others to get rid of resentment. At the causal level, rediscovering some sense of purpose. At the Buddhic level, developing universal compassion. At the Atmic level, rebuilding our faith in higher powers. So I'm going to dedicate a slide to each of these. And by the way, I should mention, I normally make a PDF available of the slides in my talks. And I will send that to the folks at the TS in England so that they can distribute it to you, members of the email list who have signed on to this, so that you'll be able to follow what I've said whenever you listen to this talk and have it to study if you wish and to think about. Obviously, I'm going far faster than anyone can take notes. I should have mentioned that at the beginning. Sorry, that's an example of trauma I just caused. What do you know? All right, going on. Following safety guidelines with the physical level. We have a task, and that is the care and appreciation of ourself. And we have to have an intention to achieve and safeguard physical health as a basis for action. So in other words, we're not just surviving, we're not just trying to keep ourselves healthy without any regard for what happens with anyone else. We're doing this so that we have a basis for action on behalf of others. Our focus is on our physical needs, and we have to develop tools. The basic tools here are quality food, quality exercise, keeping the body healthy. Our traps are our anxieties and any addictions that we might have that would tend to make it difficult for us to attend to our physical needs in helpful, healthy ways. And the solution to those traps, I would call wise action, one step at a time. I think that masters, the soul, the source, God, can do a lot to protect us from everything, in fact, but unwise actions on our part. So what we have to learn is, what is the wise action under any given set of circumstances? That may require restoring resilience in some of the other bodies. But because we exist in space and time, we can only ever take one step at a time. And if we're worrying about 200 steps down the way and every step between the next step and those 200, we're in trouble. No wonder we'll feel anxious. So we have to school ourselves very strictly in following one step at a time. How do we restore our vitality? Our task here is care and appreciation of our environs, which could be a home, a garden, our neighborhood, nature. In other words, anything that we do to be out and appreciate and enjoy and take care of and even keep clean some of these environments. This can help us restore a sense of vitality. The intention is to rekindle our gratitude, our joy, our pride for beautiful, well-kept surroundings. It's interesting. If we think of the whole world as being assaulted by disease, and if we withdraw, it isn't long before we start feeling like disease is everywhere and we lose that sense of beauty. I remember last spring wandering around the woods and the lakes and the neighborhoods of my surroundings in Boston, and just noticing the joy that was everywhere present in the leaves coming out and the flowers and the birds singing, and thinking to myself, all of this nature is completely unaware of how the human population is suffering so much from the fear of the pandemic and the actual threat of potentially becoming ill or passing on. So if you can let it in, if you can get out, if you can see these things, it isn't necessarily an ironic commentary, you could call it, by the creator on our suffering. It's more like a lifeline to help us pull ourselves up out of self-pity. Our focus should be on what I'm calling quality sense experience. And that can be something as simple as rubbing your hands on tree bark or walking barefoot in the park in the grass, sitting on the grass. There are many ways in which we can allow ourselves to have that kind of experience to help restore vitality. Our tool is what I call willingness to be here activities, things that allow us to be more present in, more willing to be present in the body and on the planet. And generally speaking, these activities are going against habits and routines because we forget that we can experience joy in such things. The solution is some degree of novelty within reason. There are certainly people who feel that the only way to get away from all of this is to go someplace in the world where the pandemic is not, and good luck. Um, so restoring vitality can require a certain degree of novelty. We also may have to recalibrate our needs and desires. Our task here is a slightly more expanded version of what we were dealing with earlier. It's the care and appreciation of our partner, our family, and our intimate friends. The real needs here are mutual happiness as opposed to the kind of happiness where we go out and buy a boat because we like the novelty of having a boat, and we can do it and we can live on the boat in order not have to deal with other people, and on it goes. Our intention is to overcome self-centered pursuit of non-essential wishes and desires. And that can also mean to appreciate the things that we need that may not be available because of shortages. That helps us determine what is an essential need. Our focus is primarily on emotional needs, and I would say that love for others and support of others are especially important. The tool is to be willing to share our feelings in the midst of all that we're experiencing, our vulnerabilities, for example. The traps is that we bottle up our feelings, and then that results in emotional explosions. And then there's a feeling of lack of safety in the home environment, and that reduces resilience. And the solution is cultivating the ability to have a heart-to-heart connection with others. At the mental level, what we need to do is promote kindness. Our task here is care and appreciation of the people that we're less connected to, our neighbors, our friends other than intimate friends, our colleagues, and I'm calling them others as opposed to strangers, but the people that we happen to encounter, all of whom are, of course, experiencing our presence in troubled times to some degree, and possibly in similar or different ways from the ways that we are, and who might be neglected or pushed out of our minds because we perceive them as being other in some way, whether it's by race or color, creed, caste, etc. So our intention here has to be to overcome bias, judgment, and resentment of differences. Our focus has to be on clearing our likes and dislikes, because that's the source of any form of resentment, and it's the basis of the mind. And there is a lot of theosophical literature, especially books by Annie Besant, that have to do with this issue of likes and dislikes. There's a book, for example, by her on the higher life that I think is worth pursuing if you want to look into likes and dislikes. Pearl, I'm going to ask you if you could possibly mute yourself, because we are all envying the fact that you're eating dinner.
Got it. She's covered. Thank you.
Okay,
Sorry.
thank you. So our tools, um, this we have to recognize as looking into our shared beliefs and values. The traps are bigotry, when we're trying to impose our beliefs and values on someone else, and withdrawal into ourselves, into self-isolation. There's probably a whole talk in and of itself just with that, as we've been seeing, for example, in the United States, with a huge upsurge of, on the one side, the Black Lives Matter movement, and on the other side, white supremacy movements. I'm going to leave that aside, but it does come under the heading, for Theosophists anyway, of learning how to promote kindness. And finally, the solution is the development of a kind of equanimity towards all. At the causal level, we'll need to rediscover our purpose. Here, our task is care and appreciation of what I'm calling spiritual family, those with whom we support the opportunity for, those with whom we experience the opportunity for mutual support and self-realization. Certainly, a theosophical study group or a meditation group would come under this heading of spiritual family. I consider the students that I work with to be a part of my spiritual family, as well as spiritual friends that I go to talk about what I'm doing with my spiritual life and to hear about what they're doing with theirs. Here, our intention is to discover or fulfill the soul's plans and purposes for the present lifetime. It's safe to assume that one aspect of that is service of humanity, but what's our unique contribution to that service? And if we focus on it and find some way to pursue it, even under pandemic conditions, we're not paralyzed. Our focus needs to be on discovering what our spiritual needs are and hopefully finding a way to meet them. Without doing that, we lose our motivation. So the real question here is, what motivates us about life purpose? The tools may be an understanding of karmic causes that supposedly comes along with the causal level of being. Again, this could be a whole evening talk. What I mean are the forces that come together to create the circumstances that we experience. So, for example, with the pandemic, I would identify some of these forces as what governments have been doing to let us know what the problem is, how bad it is, how truthful or honest they're being about the number of people who are being affected, the efficacy of any of the policies that they come up with, the ways in which they promote or censor science. So the more understanding we have of the existence of these kinds of causes and the karmic results in terms of the population and possibly affecting ourselves, the more we may have some understanding of how to fit ourselves in to a larger purpose. The traps here are a feeling of general uselessness or a feeling of depression. And even if we don't have a more specific form of life purpose that we can work on during pandemic or troubled times, sometimes simple volunteer work is enough to overcome that sense of uselessness or depression. And then finally, there's something that I call turning stuckness into flow. If we try to fix anything, on the one hand, it may be too big for us to fix and we may feel overwhelmed by it. Or if we try to fix someone, they may resent the fact that we see them as a problem and we're trying to fix them. But I think if we're seeing things from this causal or spiritual perspective, everything is about flow, a flow of energy. And if we try to restore that flow of energy by recognizing stuckness and taking some small action to move things forward, we're actually working at this spiritual level, not only restoring our own resilience at this level, but also helping others. What about developing compassion from the Buddhic level? Here, our task is the care and appreciation of humanity. Our intention is to work for the greater good of all, not excluding oneself. I think it's important for us to remember that whatever we do in the world has to be understood against the limits of our own ability to take care of ourselves. And so, if we're going to work for the greater good of all, we really do have to include ourselves in that. Not selfishly, but just because if we break down, we're no good to the rest of the world. Our focus here is on human suffering. Our tools are the familiar term selfless service. The traps here are overwhelmed by the immensity of individual and mass suffering. This is something I've seen often in my classes. People get clogged by reading the news, and reading the news becomes a kind of trauma because they feel called to do something, and it seems as if there's nothing they can do. I will be talking in more depth about this in a few more slides. Our solution here is discerning when there's a genuine call. This is something that I am astonished I have not really seen very much about in theosophical literature. Learning the discernment to know when you're called to do something about human suffering. There is a set of guidelines that you can extract from the key to theosophy, and that comes up in a couple of slides. But other than that, it's not, I think, emphasized sufficiently to know when there's a call, to know what that means to have a call, and then to respond to it. And then finally, rebuilding our faith at the atmic level. Our task here is the care and appreciation of all life. Our intention is to be an example of joyful, compassionate equanimity and service. Our focus is wherever there's need. Our tools are something that I call mind of the master. That comes up in a couple of slides, but what I mean here is if we can understand at all what that state of consciousness involves, the mind of the master, how might we think like a master? How might we ask ourselves what we can do under any given set of circumstances in order to be of the best possible help? So having some idea of what that state of consciousness might be like can actually be very useful in rebuilding our faith. We start to see not only how much we help others, but we may also see how much we're supported and helped by others. And this rebuilds faith in soul, humanity, and higher powers. The trap, of course, is ego inflation, thinking that we can do more than we actually can do, or even bragging about how much we're doing when in fact we may not be doing anything, just on the basis of spiritual status, for example, superiority. And finally, the solution is non-attachment to results and humility in praise or blame. These are two of the major lessons of the Bhagavad Gita. And so I would recommend that as yet another way of thinking about how to deal with resilience in troubled times. In particular, there's an Indian spiritual teacher no longer deceased, or sorry, no longer living, by the name of Eknath Easwaran, who wrote a series of books called the Bhagavad Gita for Daily Living. It's in 3 volumes. It took me about 9 months to read just a few pages every night when I was going to bed. And during a particularly troubled time in my own life, it was enormously helpful. And I would recommend it as an excellent guidebook in addition to our theosophical literature for dealing with what we're going through now. So now this mind of the master. I want to recall to mind something that Annie Besant said about this. The consciousness of the master stretches itself out in any direction in which he sends it. assimilates itself with any point to which he directs it, knows anything which he wills to know, and all this in order that he may help perfectly, that there may be nothing that he cannot feel, nothing that he cannot foster, nothing that he cannot strengthen, nothing that he cannot aid in its evolution. To him, the whole world is one vast evolving whole, and his place in it is that of a helper of evolution. He is able to identify himself with any step, and at that step to give the aid that is needed. That comes from Man and His Bodies from 1896, and I would contend that that is the very description of what I'm calling joyful, compassionate service in equanimity. An interesting exercise or practice that you might want to make if you get the PDFs for this is to think about how differently you would think about this if you substituted the word he for we throughout this. And think about that as a set of guidelines for dealing with troubled times. Now, if that seems like too much, Annie Besant has some useful things to say about civic virtues. This is sort of a basic, what we can apply right now about what I was just describing. She calls self-sacrifice a civic virtue, also compassion, the willingness to endure for the sake of others. Of course, we also need some self-care there so that we last as long as it needs to support them. Taking the burdens of the weak on the shoulders of the strong, realizing that duty is greater than rights, responsibility more vital than self-protection. This is a huge deal right now in terms of ethics throughout the world as people struggle with such questions as to wear a mask or not to wear a mask, or to get vaccinated or not to be vaccinated. So realizing that duty is greater than rights, responsibility more vital than self-protection might be a helpful guideline for thinking about those situations. This came from her book, The Changing World from 1909. So now I want to go not only to amplify on what Annie Besant was talking about with self-sacrifice, but also about what I was mentioning earlier about being overwhelmed by the amount of suffering in the world that we might feel some responsibility to serve and ameliorate. So this is what HPB had to say about self-sacrifice. Self-sacrifice has to be performed with discrimination, and such a self-abandonment, if made without justice or blindly, regardless of subsequent results, may often prove not only made in vain, but harmful. So this is the closest I've come to seeing anything about waiting to look if there's a call. She calls it discrimination. We could also call it discernment, but we could also call it inner listening to find out when we are actually called to operate on the basis of self-sacrifice for others. Continuing, another phrase from the key to Theosophy is, Theosophy teaches self-abnegation, but does not teach rash and useless self-sacrifice, nor does it justify fanaticism. Now, specifically, I was thinking about this in terms of one of my students who was completely falling apart because there were all kinds of issues going on in her family, several generations living under the same household, but she wanted to be on the picket lines for Black Lives Matter and some of the other environmental concerns and so on. And really, her resilience was reduced to the point where I was seriously concerned about her mental health. And it seems like HPB is talking very specifically to a kind of mentality that I think a lot of us share, wanting to get out there and be on the picket lines to work for some cause, when in fact it might not be a wise form of self-sacrifice under the circumstances. But what then is our theosophical work? So here's what HPB had to say about it. No theosophist ought to be contented with an idle or frivolous life, doing no real good to himself and still less to others. Now, I think idle or frivolous, we might think about that in terms of people who just indulge in happiness, pleasure, that sort of thing. But I think of it in terms of anxiety, overwhelm, depression, and self pity because we're in troubled times. He should work for the benefit of the few who needs his help, who need his help, if he is unable to toil for humanity, and thus work for the advancement of the theosophical cause. So here, a range of what we're able to do is specifically limited to the few who need our help. Now, I think the distinction she's making is we could work for the theosophical cause by working for the Theosophical Society itself. If we're not doing that, we can still work for humanity by working with those people that we have direct access to. And I think it's confirmed by what she says on what our actual theosophical duty is. The first of the theosophical duties is to do one's duty by all men, and especially by those to whom one's specific responsibilities are due, because one has either voluntarily undertaken them, such as marriage ties, or because one's destiny has allied one to them. I mean, those we owe to parents or next of kin. I would also add spiritual family and our most intimate friends. Again, this comes from the key to theosophy. But these are the people that are within our reach. And it often happens that the people we're closest to can have experiences of trauma at any of the levels we've been talking about, and will need a great deal of support from us to get through them. And that is our work during troubled times. And it is essentially a theosophical work. Again, I think this is confirmed by what Blavatsky, HPB, said on theosophical charity. These are drawn from a longer sentence, but I want to emphasize the way that she said it. Every italicized word here is her word that she italicized. Personal exertion for others, personal mercy and kindness, personal interest in the welfare of those who suffer, personal sympathy, forethought, and assistance in their troubles or needs. Now, she was talking about charity so that we're not just writing a check and sending it to an organization and forgetting about it. But I think in troubled times, we also have to realize how apropos this quote is for the range of people that we actually can reach. And of course, if we're under lockdown, there's almost nobody beyond our family and spiritual family and intimate friends that we can actually reach. So this brings me to my final slide. This is a summing up of what I've talked about this evening in terms of resilience in troubled times. I'll call it a basic spiritual practice. Now, everything that I've said up until this time can feed into this practice, but I'm calling this a basic spiritual practice because I think in one slide I can sum up what we need to do in order to deal properly with the troubled times that we're experiencing. And I think you'll understand based on the talk that while I'm not specifically using theosophical terms as I describe this spiritual practice, that it's completely informed by the things that I've shown you, the quotes and the principles that we've talked about. So the first is show up in compassion. And that essentially means welcome all comers. Anybody who shows up to you, show up and be fully present in them and embrace them in some understanding of their challenges. Be fully present with them in equanimity. So no judgment, but especially help to promote in yourself and in them what I'm calling consent to everything truly needful. In other words, is it possible to help people identify what is a truly useful approach to the troubled times and what may not be so truly useful? For example, indulging in self-pity, just to offer one. That would be maybe the easiest one to point out to some people. But be fully present and at the same time, be kind to yourself and others in service. Specifically, let every comer know they're seen, they're heard, they're understood, they're loved. The reason for this is I think our basic lack of resilience comes from the fact that almost no one feels fully supported in every area of their life. The least we can do for anyone to help restore them to resilience is to demonstrate that we support them. And the best way to do that is to let them know we see them, we hear them, we understand them, we love them. And that may even be in whatever differences they have from us. Take one step at a time, and if you can, take it in joy so that we are an example to others. And here, work for the greater good, not excluding your own. And these four steps and their applications are essentially what I mean by joyful, compassionate equanimity in service, which I believe is an appropriate theosophical response of resilience in troubled times.